Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Get the volume a little. All right. So today we're going to continue on with memory, and that's going to be the topic for the rest of this week. So we're going to have a quiz on Thursday for a specific type of memory, declarative memory. And I'll get the quizzes back to you soon. It's well, just frankly, the scores went up quite a bit on the last two, and you know, you got to trust people. But I wanted to kind of mull that over, but just to kind of let everybody know, you know, that's why they're delayed a little bit. You know, integrity matters, and this is an opportunity to show it. But I will get the curve quizzes if there is a curve. Get it back to you, you know, probably in the next day or so. All right. So let's see. Let's get moving with. Are there any questions before we start resuming talking about memory? All right, let's get to it. So I think we left off with this kind of weird study with testing people's memory when they're on the beach versus when they're underwater with scuba gear and all that. Oop, here we go. I think this is where he left off, right? Maybe. All right, so I don't want to repeat. Okay, so this is just, I think, just putting everything together from what we talked about, that memory isn't just one thing. There's no silver bullet for making memory work great or one reason why it doesn't work great. If anything, when we start talking about some of these types of brain damage that affect memory, there's lots of different ways for things to go wrong. And there's really just only a few ways for things to work really well. You know, that's part of the logic. Remember, we talked about lesions. We're going to talk about brain damage today. So upload in your fully functioning brain the idea that, all right, a lesion can disrupt things in a very non-specific manner. So if we want to relate specific aspects of cognition, we're going to want to look for things like double dissociations and convergent evidence with fMRI in people who don't have brain damage and things of that nature before we want to draw strong conclusions about this particular part of the brain is important for this particular aspect of cognition. And today, those particular aspects are going to be different types of memory, different systems of memory. So we'll get to that next, but just to kind of wrap up what we talked about the other day, so you can think about these different factors that influence the likelihood of remembering something is falling along kind of several buckets. You know, one bucket is what is it that you're actually learning to begin with? Is it verbal? Is it pictorial? Does it have the opportunity to be coded in different ways, such as with pictures? What happens during encoding? How is attention being manipulated, for example? Are you deeply thinking about the objects that you're going to try to remember later, or is it just kind of skimming over them? What happens during storage? Some of these interference effects that we talked about. And then lastly, how do you interrogate memory? How do you try to get that information back and use it? There are lots of different ways to get the information back, so to speak. And we just put that under this broad category of retrieval. All right, so all that is why there's no one best way to remember. It's this it's a group effort. All right. So is anybody familiar with the Bourne, Jason Bourne and his movies? What's the deal with him? What's the premise in terms of his memory? Nobody's seen Jason Bourne movies yet?
I have not, no.
Well, he's got amnesia and he's trying to like reconstruct his entire life.
Yeah. So he has, in one sense, he has a profound memory deficit. So he's this guy that can't remember his past, or is just fragments of his past, and he's trying to reconnect with what happened to him. So that's one aspect of his memory that seems impaired. But he's also this super highly skilled secret agent. And I think this must have been the first movie where he gets into this fight in, I don't remember, a restaurant or a bar or something. And he has all these advanced fighting skills, karate, that sort of thing, that he didn't know he had. And he was talking to somebody, and I probably should have refreshed my memory about this, the movies, telling somebody that when he walks into, let's say, a restaurant or something, he'll notice the license plates in the cars out in the parking lot, and he'll notice kind of everybody in the room, and he'll have an escape plan. And he's perplexed because he doesn't know where these skills came from or why he has these tendencies, right? This is before he knew that he was a secret agent at all. So it shows at this point that the memory isn't one thing, and some of his memory was greatly impaired. His autobiographical memory, his episodic memory about who he is, what we typically think about when we say memory. But these other forms of memory, like all the training that it took, many years most likely to become really great at fighting, that memory was preserved. He was able to beat up the bad guys. So it shows that you have memory, these parallel kind of ways of remembering things can coexist. And one can be selectively interfered with while the others can be relatively preserved. So this is the basic idea behind what we call memory systems, that memory isn't just one thing, that there are multiple different types of ways of encoding information and storing it and retrieving it and in general using that information. And that we can find dissociations in that. So before we kind of get into some of these specific examples from patient studies, let's just get a clear sense of what is a system. We talk about memory systems. It sounds, scientific, but what is a system? What counts as a system? And how do you know when you have one system rather than two systems? Your thoughts? We can take a familiar example, like what's a transportation system?
Like the Via bus?
So, sorry?
Like the bus system?
Okay, so we got a bus system. So what is it? What characterizes the bus system?
Taking multiple stops and taking forever.
So okay, yeah. So you have the unit of transportation are buses, and yeah, they go multiple places. They're oftentimes slow. It's hard to get from point to point because you can't just tell the bus exactly where you want to go and it takes you there. But it has the central aspect of transportation is it gets people from one place to somewhere else. Okay, so we can think about maybe the bus system as one system. Let's contrast that with something else. Like what are some other aspects of transportation systems?
It's movement.
Yeah,
Delivery?
so kind of, yeah, things moving, kind of getting from place to place and different ways of getting there. So you can think about, let's think about airplanes. So they're similar to buses and they both move and they both get you from place to place. But there's some differences too, right? There are only a few places where you can get on an airplane as opposed to many bus stops. Most cities only have one or two airports. And the distances traveled are a lot longer. So this could be a distinction between the airline transportation system and the bus system, but they're both ways of getting around. So they're both examples of transportation systems, right? One goes pretty close to the ground. The other one flies up in the air. Those are differences. One is really fast. The other is a lot slower. One travels farther, so your actual trip may be a lot longer, take more time for a plane versus a bus, but you may get a lot farther away from where you started, right? So once you start thinking about systems, there are all these distinctions that can be made, and there's no one way that says this is the way it has to be divided, right? If we wanted to, we could just look at a public transportation system and think about buses and planes as both examples of that, let's say. And maybe that's different from cars. Or we could group them all under one transportation system, or we can break it down into three: cars, buses, and planes. Cars and buses are similar, they both use the roads, right? So there are a lot of different distinctions that can be made when you think about systems. And the same thing happens with researchers who study memory. People propose ways of breaking memory down into different systems, and they think about different aspects of memory to make that judgment. And it is a judgment call. So there's a lot of different ways people think about memory systems. What I'm presenting in this class, I think, is as close as it gets to a widely agreed upon way of thinking about memory systems. But if you get into the literature, each researcher kind of has their own ideas about what constitutes these different systems. But I think you're getting a pretty general flavor of kind of where the literature is at now and what generally people would consider to be different memory systems. And
Literally
it's kind of
every time I think about memory, especially for people whose brains just fire off way too quick, I always think of bullet trains.
yeah.
Like how it's kind of like this sort of unstoppable force, sometimes uncheckable depending on the person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish we had bullet trains around here. It'd make it a lot easier to get to Houston.
What? The United States actually caring about people being able to get from point A to point B?
Yeah.
What? Seriously?
Yeah. But bullet trains, I don't know if you guys have been out, but it's really cool. I mean, you can go super fast. In France, they don't mess around. And Japan also, they have the Japan's is actually probably even faster. But at any rate, we got good stuff too in other ways. So that's the way it is. So let's see. Right, thinking about memory systems. So researchers, it's kind of a mixture of different factors that are used to define memory systems. And so we're going to start off with one that thinks about time. So is the information in memory for a short period of time or longer periods of time? So this commonly, let me just get the pointer going here. Like I mentioned the other day, we're not really going to talk too much about sensory memory. It's pretty cool. Your sensory systems all retain basic information about stimuli for short periods of time. For vision, it's about half a second or so. For the auditory system, it's a little more complicated, anywhere from a second or two to maybe tens of seconds. Short-term memory, long-term memory, there's no one dividing line that says if it lasts up to this amount of time, it's short, and if it goes 1 millisecond past that, it's now considered long. It's a more kind of general flavor of short-term memory. We're talking about tasks where memory is retained for seconds, maybe tens of seconds or so. So the example of giving you guys a few numbers to remember, and then we wait 10 seconds and then you give it back, you repeat back to me what I said, that would be a classic example of a short-term memory task. Long-term memory, in the laboratory, oftentimes it's not very long at all. Some of these long-term memory studies, there's like 20 minutes between the study and the test sessions, but it can last, of course, much longer. So Jason Bourne and his autobiographical memory, his memories of his 10th birthday or something, that's several decades old for that character. So that's long, that's just really kind of justifiably long. So all these kind of long-term memories, anywhere from things you study in the lab for 30 minutes or so up to a lifetime, we'll just put that under another bucket of long-term memory. All right, so we have this time-based axis of thinking about systems, but that's not the only way that we divide these systems up. Another one is what is the content of what is memorized or remembered or tried to be retrieved, attempted to be retrieved later on. And so I can think about, well, are we remembering basic features? So it could be, for example, just looking at abstract paintings, and you can tell the difference between one painting and another, even if it's abstract, or remembering speech information, phonological, semantic, that sort of thing. Another way, which is really important for what we're doing, is conscious versus unconscious memory. So conscious would be typically things that you can talk about, that you're self-aware of, that you know something, and the details, and you can tell people about it. So you can maybe tell people about what happened in this class session today, later on in the afternoon, or maybe next week. Or I don't know, maybe there's something that really catches your interest in this class and it sticks in your memory, and you may remember it a decade from now, potentially. Probably not, but sometimes, when you reflect back on your life, there's certain things that just get seared into your memory, and they're not necessarily really big, important life events. It's just certain things that just kind of stick with you, which, by the way, is, we don't understand why that is, why certain things just stick and really stick. But at any rate, you'd be consciously aware of that. Other things like Jason Bourne with his karate skills, for example, he just kind of knows how to do it, and may remember some or he could, if he gets his memory back, remember training, but probably not every training session. Every training session on learning how to do a karate chop, but he just kind of does it. So that's more of an unconscious skill memory. As we'll talk about, people can clearly remember things they had no idea they even learned. And we'll get to that later on. So this conscious, unconscious division is also important in thinking about different memory systems. And then lastly, these distinctions between memory systems are informed by anatomical studies. The idea that if you get selective damage to one part of the brain, does that lead to selective impairment in one type of memory? And if you get enough evidence that kind of points to that there's an important nodes, a certain part of the brain is really important for a certain type of memory, then you're on stronger ground for saying maybe this is one particular type of memory system. And it turns out that there are certain parts of the brain that are important for various types of memory systems. So we'll get into that as well. So like I said, it's kind of this hodgepodge way of thinking about different memory systems. But that's kind of the way it is for now, at least in our science. And this is showing you kind of an overall view of sort of looking at the landscape of different types of memory. So at the very top, we have the time-based distinction between short-term memory and long-term memory. And today we're going to talk about both short-term and long-term memory. Once we get to declarative memory on Thursday, we're going to be focusing just on long-term memory. So that's one type of long-term memory. So once you get into long-term, you can look at explicit memory. This falls along the lines of things that you're consciously aware of. They could be episodic events, a specific thing that happened to you at a particular time in a particular place. You can pull up that memory. And so that's considered an episodic memory because it has that contextual information about what happened at that episode. Whereas other memory, you're consciously aware of, fact-based memory. Thinking about the Battle of Flowers or something, the anniversary is coming up. So that's a fact, but you may not know exactly where you learned about that. Sometime, I guess, for those of you that are from Texas, they really teach a lot about Texas history here in school. I understand it's kind of a big deal. So maybe that was when you first learned about this. And you may have an episodic memory of that event, or you may not. It may be just something that at some point, all of us learned George Washington was the first president. A lot of us, maybe most of us, won't know specifically what you were doing when you first got that piece of information. So that's a distinction there between the semantic memory about Washington being president number one and the episodic memory, which fades away about the time when you first learned that. So there you have it. So that's kind of the basic layout. For this non-declarative memory, this is also really kind of a grab bag of different types of memory that just all kind of fall into the theme of you don't have to consciously be aware of that memory to show that you learned something. You can be, but it's not an absolute necessity. So procedural memory, skill learning, this is where Jason Bourne and his karate skills comes in. So this would be if you learn sports, if you learn a musical instrument or sing, you spend a lot of time learning and your skill gets better and better, as you practice more and more. So that falls under procedural memory. We're going to talk about memories that are perceptual memory that's tied to processing sensory information. So that's the perceptual representation system. We'll just briefly talk about that today. Classical conditioning, I don't think we're going to get to this, but you learned about it in Psych 101. The classic Pavlov's dog, the bell goes off, the dog starts salivating. That's an example also of non-declarative or implicit memory. And non-associative learning, habituation, that's another thing that we're not going to really talk too much about. But if, for example, you heard a very loud noise, you may jump. If that noise keeps going, you're not going to jump nearly as much, and eventually you'll stop jumping. So that's non-associative learning. Right,
I actually have a little example for this, and it's kind of interesting. And then it also goes into a little bit of like American work ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my online friends was saying, I had a super bad day at work. I had a super bad week at work last week. And now I feel just super bad about going in. Like, am I just being crazy? Am I being irrational? I'm like, no, you literally have these associations. You're learning associations with this job.
Yep.
And it's crazy how we learn about this in psychology. We learn about these associations, and yet we totally discount it when it comes to working towards like our job and just general mental health in general.
Yes.
So
yes. Hallelujah. Yeah. And this is one thing actually, I have another class called Reason and Intuition that makes much stronger contact with the real world. But this is something I'd encourage you guys to do just as a general habit, because it could be useful for. And that was whoever was just talking. It's a super important point that the stuff we learn here in class. My internet connections. I hope you guys can still hear me. All right. I'll keep talking as if you can still hear me. I guess it's all right now. It does apply to the real world. And so get in the habit of maybe thinking about some connections. Now, some it's more esoteric. When we're talking about functional MRI and EEG, you know, most people aren't going to be having their brains scanned in everyday life. But a lot of the principles still apply. And especially when you start thinking about cognition, this idea of this non-associative learning, you know, one basic principle of memory is it's just happening. You just go through life and it's happening. So these various sensor memory systems we're going to be talking about, most of them automatically start information just kind of is automatically encoded and stored and potentially retrieved. So it's worthwhile to ask yourself, for example, what sort of environment am I going through on a daily basis? And how might that the residue of those experiences be affecting me later on? Right? I know it's kind of a big thing, but in a lot of ways, we started off with that quote about memory being who we are, and were it not for the binding glue of memory, our experiences would scatter out to the wind. So it's worthwhile kind of thinking about what you're learning every day, and not, you know, in class. I'm talking about just in life, and how might that affect you later on? It's a fascinating topic. It's just living being, and so I'm hoping maybe the ANR or having days at work and other things moving forward. So in some ways, you can think about it as kind of empowering. If you know about how your memory works and how that affects who you are, you can take a little more control over it. All right. Well, actually, so we were talking about bullet trains in France. So this is the side effect of being a professor and liking, you know, just loving doing research and stuff. So there's, we're going to talk a lot about the hippocampus, because it's one of these structures that I alluded to earlier. It seems very important for particular memory systems. In this case, the hippocampus is very important for epilepsy. And so how did we know about the hippocampus and what sort of hippocampus is associated with, as distinct from other memories? All right. So enter, so as you know, a lot of patients have some dramatic deficit in one particular aspect, a lot of different aspects of cognition, in which case, you know, somebody suffers a really bad stroke and they're not recovering very well. Scientifically, it's a tragedy, but also scientifically, it's hard to study because you have too many interpretations, and it's difficult to child. This another, his name was Henry Maloyson, by the way. He recently had anonymity because most of the talents maintain that. RB, I think RB's still around, but I'm not sure, is another one that had an even more selective lesion within the hippocampus. I'll show you some anatomical pictures in a minute, but there's a subfield called CA1. A1 means one, it's the hippocampus around why they're talking payments for. Just one sub-region of the campus and had a depth very similar to what H had. HM had tissue weakening, having severe epilepsy, and it was thought the seizures started in and around the hippocampus. That's why neurosurgeon Scoville went in and both as well as well as structure in front of the hippocampus called the amygdala. All this took all of it out. Unknown deficit in episodic. That deficit, HM. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. No, scratch that. He had HM deficit was more along the lines of difficulty in coding experiences in those more language. I mean, just to make it clear. This ahead, he had difficulty coding and gaining information about what happened. So he did Jason Bourne aware of upbringing and all that. But HM's short-term memory was intact. You could talk with him just fine. You could give him a few numbers to remember. If you don't distract him, and that's a big if you don't distract him, then he could repeat back those numbers again and do so accurately. As we'll talk about later on, as people studied HM even more, researchers realized that he could learn certain types of information. So his memory wasn't just knocked out across the board moving forward. It was a very specific memory system that was greatly impaired, his episodic memory. So I'll give you some data on this in a minute or two. All right. So one way to tap into the question of, well, does HM learn anything? It seems like if you talk with him, for example, and then you walk out of the room and you don't know HM, you didn't know him before his surgery, come back into the room, he'll think you're a new person. He won't remember that he just met you 5 minutes earlier. So that's how profound his memory deficit was. And again, it was for episodic memory, things that happen at a particular place. So as part of investigating, kind of spreading out and asking, what about some other aspects of memory? Researchers use something called a mirror drawing task. And so the way this was set up, the low-tech version is you actually use a mirror. The high-tech version is you can just set up the mouse to go kind of opposite to where you normally do it. So if I move the mouse over here to the right, they could program the mouse to move to the left. And if I move the mouse up, it could program the cursor to go down. So you can get high-tech if you want to about this. But basically, it's difficult initially to draw lines within this kind of star-shaped object here if you have everything mirror reversed. And so it takes a while for people to learn how to do this. And this is showing that the data from the actual article by Milner, it's almost 60 years old by now, showing that there is indeed a learning curve for this. So when you start off and you measure errors by, okay, did they go outside the lines of the star? And when people start off on the first day, they make a lot of errors. But then with practice, day 2, 3, 4, 5, they get a lot better at doing this mirror drawing. So they learn to get used to this distortion in what they see and then adjust their hand accordingly. So if they need to go left, they need to move the hand left to kind of see the image go right, for example. So people get a lot better at this. And you can do it with your right hand and left hand. They're both learning curves for that. This is HM. So this is what HM was doing. And so he was able to learn this, and it was at the level of that you would expect for anybody else, somebody who didn't have their hippocampi taken out with all these other structures. But if you asked HM, okay, have you done this before? He wouldn't know that he did it before. And the researcher that did this, Suzanne Corkin, she had these. She would say, did you walk in and HM would joke with her about, what's the deal with this mirror? And it could be the 10th time he's done this mirror learning, like 10 days in a row. And he would still say, what's that thing? That's kind of weird. Why you want me to do this drawing with this mirror set up? That's bizarre, but all right, I don't have anything else to do now. All right, fine, let's do it. So he didn't consciously remember ever learning to do this mirror drawing, yet his behavior objectively showed that learning had taken place. So that's a classic example of how you can get these parallel memory systems. The conscious episodic aspect of the memory wasn't retrievable. He didn't realize that he'd ever done this before. But the non-conscious, kind of non-procedural, procedural learning, non-declarative procedural learning aspects of this, he was able to learn. He was able to do so at a pretty normal rate. Okay, so does that make sense, guys? All right. So this is one of the better pictures, I think, showing what the hippocampus looks like. This was something when I mentioned before that when I went to grad school, I did neurobiology research, and I studied individual neurons in rats as they walked around and did spatial cognition tasks. And so the hippocampus is also very important for spatial cognition. We'll get to that probably a little in a few class sessions. And it has this weird, it's hard to visualize the shape of it because it's a C-shaped structure that also goes towards the center of the brain and then up. So here at the very top, it's kind of towards the front, high, and then it goes down lower and wraps around here. And so this whole thing is the hippocampus. And so this was what was taken out by Scoville. The amygdala is more or less right about here, and that was also taken out. And this is showing using magnetic resonance imaging what that looks like. Several decades later, HM surgery was in 1957. He was probably scanned here around 1996 or 1997. So good 40 years later, he still has, there's just this big hole where his hippocampi used to be on both sides. And this is compared to an age-matched control. So there's a nice plump hippocampus right in there. These, you don't need to worry about the specific abbreviations here. These are just areas in and around the hippocampus, but don't worry about that. The main point is you can see that there's just this big hole where his hippocampus used to be. And that gets filled in, by the way, with cerebral spinal fluid. So the brain is bathed in cerebral spinal fluid. So once you take out the tissues, some of the brain collapses a little bit to fill some of the space, and then cerebral spinal fluid comes in and fills up the rest. And it turns out with additional fine-grained information from these MRI scans, we found out that there was a little bit of the hippocampus at the very back of HM's hippocampus that was not taken out. So that gave us a little bit of information in that the spared region of the hippocampus, it certainly wasn't good enough to maintain normal episodic memory in HM. And so the speculation was that, well, even though these neurons may not be dead, they're not contributing much, if anything, to episodic memory. So the surgery itself disrupted the structure so much that even though there's a little bit of neural tissue still left over, it was largely non-functional. That's kind of the sort of the party line as far as what people think about that. But it wasn't. It's worthwhile knowing there wasn't a complete hippocampectomy for HM, but nonetheless, it had these profound deficits in his memories we've been talking about. All right. So at this point, you're probably wondering, well, what about a double dissociation? Right? Because our one explanation is, well, episodic memory seems very complicated. It involves conscious access to kind of our thoughts. It has this metacognition flavor to it, thinking about what you did. Maybe that's just more susceptible to brain damage. Maybe if you damage other parts of the brain, you'll get an equally bad deficit. So here's where we want to look for something along these lines. So we have HM and RB and other patients like this, where their short-term memory is intact, right? You can talk with HM, he can remember digits for short periods of time and letters and all sorts of other things. But their episodic memory, the long-term episodic memory is impaired. Are the people out there, question mark, who are impaired at short-term memory, but have good long-term memory? This is particularly intriguing because you might think, well, don't you need to have short-term memory first in order to transfer that knowledge into long-term memory? Is it kind of like a bucket brigade where you got sensory memory and that sensory information goes into short-term memory and short-term memory goes into long-term memory? That was the model up until the 1960s. And there are several reasons why we now think that that's not quite correct. But one is what we're about to talk about, which is there are people out there that have very bad short-term memories. And this is one patient, their initials are EE, who have really bad digit spans. And it's not that they can remember nothing in terms of short-term memory, but whereas you and I, if I gave you a bunch of digits to remember, you could remember, let's say 7 or so. With you guys, maybe the average is even 8. College students tend to be better than the population at this. Theirs is 1 or 2 numbers, and that's all they can handle before they'll start forgetting. So even though it's not totally knocked out, short-term memory isn't totally knocked out, they're way, way, way below average. So this is giving us some data showing that it's possible to at least knock out some aspects of short-term memory and get more or less a double dissociation, or at least some semblance of a double dissociation relative to what we see with HM and RB. Because EE and other patients like EE, they have episodic memory. They can tell you about what happened to them. There may not be the best episodic memory, but it's within relatively normal range. And again, these are patients with a very circumscribed short-term memory deficit, so they have other aspects of cognition are largely intact, which is why we think that A, it's hard to knock out short-term memory, as we'll see in a minute, and B, you have these other aspects of cognition that can also help kind of pick up the slack. So however it occurs, these people are able to have long-term memories and episodic memories that aren't too bad. All right, so that's our more or less double dissociation. And I'm hedging a little bit because these studies tend to be they'll use digit span tasks, for example, but you may have it for verbal, for let's say in the auditory modality, but maybe less so for the visual modality or vice versa. So in my read of the literature, it's a little more idiosyncratic. It's not like HM where episodic memories en masse kind of just are not encoded well and retrieved. Here, it's a little iffier. You get people with short-term memory deficits, but it's not totally across the board. And here's a reason why. So we can think about this as the board. And please, please, please do not go in and try to memorize every little thing on this diagram here. I do not want you to do that, so please don't. I want you to get the basic idea, which is that in various parts of the brain, as we talked about with sensory systems, different types of sensory information is represented for perception. It also seems to be important for memory, especially short-term memory. And you can study this with human imaging studies, such as fMRI, or you can put electrodes directly into the brains of monkeys. And you can have them, for example, let's just grab you can have monkeys remember the direction of motion. I think that's what these arrows are supposed to be. Yeah, motion. And you can show them a bunch of dots that are moving, let's say, from this side of the screen to that side of the screen. And then you can test their memory on that 10 seconds later or 20 seconds later and give them a set of dots and say, are these dots moving in the same direction or not? And I moved it up the second time, so the monkey would say no. So in order to do that, they need to retain a sensory record, short-term memory, of the direction of the dots for the first sample, and then compare that to the direction of dots for the second sample. And so if you measure activity in some of these areas that are sensitive to motion when you're perceiving motion, those areas also tend to have neurons that keep firing during the interval in a short-term memory task between the first item that you encoded and the second one that you use to test memory. And this you see in for all sorts of things. You can do this with shapes and colors. You can remember spatial information. It's not limited to vision. You can do it with sounds. But you see how distributed this is. Look at all these areas that Christoffel et al. Coded as having these neurons that seem to maintain or support short-term memory function. So if you went in, if there was some sort of brain damage that knocked out all these areas, the person is going to have so many other cognitive deficits that they may not even be studyable. They may not even, they may be in a coma for all we know. So that's probably one reason why it's really difficult to just knock out short-term memory. But we can see these selective deficits like I talked about with EE. Whereas with episodic memory, we looked at a much more circumscribed structure, right? The hippocampus. It's not like that's the be-all to end-all for episodic memory, but it seems to be a very critical node, such that if you knock that out by some sort of damage, you're probably going to have trouble with episodic memory, particularly if it's like HM, both hippocampi are taken out. That's why after HM, and I think there are a couple there, Scoville mentioned some other patients as well, neurosurgeons stopped taking out both hippocampi. Because they knew if you take out one, it will make your episodic memory likely worse or bad, but it won't lead to catastrophic failures like what we saw with HM. So having one hippocampus is like a spare tire, like those little skinny spare tires that you need to use if you get a flat sometimes. That's kind of what having one hippocampus can get you to the gas station. All right. All right, so are there any questions about episodic memory, short-term memory, these different areas of the brain that seem susceptible to problems if you damage them? All right, moving on. So now we're going to talk about procedural learning and have an example where people can learn something and they're not even consciously aware of ever having learned it. In the laboratory, we do this in typical scientific fashion with a boring experiment. And so this is what we have people do. We sit them down and say, yes, yes, you're going to get extra credit. Yes, yes. All right, do this boring experiment. No, no, really, you'll get extra credit. So you have these 4 buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a screen with some boxes or lines. And then you just simply have them press the button that's underneath where an X shows up, for example. And there are lots of variations on this basic task. And so X shows up here, you press the button, let's say number 4. X shows up next trial over here, then you press 2, and you just go on and on and on and on and on. Unbeknownst to the subjects, there's a sequence in there that repeats. And it's usually long, typically at least eight trials before the sequence repeats. And so it could be, the pattern could be button 1, 4, 2, 1, 3, 2, 4, 3. And then it just keeps going on and on and on, repeating that same sequence. Now, hardly anybody notices this. And if you do notice it, you probably need to have your head examined because there's better things to think about in this boring task than the sequence. But so hardly anybody ever notices this thing. Yet you can test that the memory is being laid down by measuring their reaction times as a function of experience. So you have them do this, let's say you do it for half an hour or something. And then you measure it. I said, that's the first 5 minutes. What are the reaction times like? And then the second 5 minutes and the third 5 minutes and so on. And I'll show you some data on next on this. This is the sort of thing that HM and other patients with medial temporal lobe lesions can learn. So again, we're seeing a dissociation now with a different type of memory, in this case, procedural memory, procedural learning. And so this is an example of that, where you just look at the overall reaction times. And when you have the sequence going, R is supposed to be random. So that's when it's just a random set of, the specific locations where the X shows up is just randomly determined. The sequence is not turned on yet. And then you start going with the sequence. Let's see the next trial block, say the second 5 minutes. And then they'll get better at the task in general. So they'll speed up. But we can control for that next. But you can see they get faster and faster and faster when the sequence is going. Then what you do, you say, well, all right, maybe they're just getting better at the task. Let's throw in a random sequence. And then reaction times slow down when it's random. And then you go back to the original sequence, reaction times speed up again. So this is a way of controlling for the idea that they're just getting more comfortable with the task. They're getting more familiar with it, so they get faster. All right, so this is our metric for having learned something about the sequence. And then if you ask them at the end of the experiment, and the questioning is usually kind of indirect. Hey, did you notice anything unusual about that sequence? No, it's boring. Did you notice anything that may have been, I don't know, repetitive? No is the typical answer. But if you start leading them on a little bit, then they may start thinking about reasons why it may be repetitive, and they hardly ever would get the actual sequence. So people really are not, this is kind of all going on under the radar of their consciousness. Now, we can ask, how might this be impaired by brain damage, right? That's our typical approach here. We're laying out, here's an aspect of memory systems, and here's a lesion in one part of the brain that can impact that type of memory system. And it turns out that the sequence learning is impaired in Parkinson's disease patients. And I don't know, are you guys familiar with Parkinson's disease? Does anybody know somebody that had it?
I don't know anyone that's had it, but I know what it is.
My grandpa has it.
Okay, do you guys want to kind of share with the class a little bit about kind of what it's like, what some of the symptoms are? So it's classically considered a motor disorder. And so these people, they will have difficulty getting moving. So if they're sitting, they have difficulty standing up. And it's not because they have problems with their muscles or fatigue or anything like that. It's literally getting the motor programs going so they can move. And then once they're moving, then they have difficulty stopping. Probably one of the most obvious problems is that they will have tremors. Their hands will shake. Oftentimes, one side is worse than the other, especially early on in the disease. And it can be debilitating. So this can really, once it's progressive, it doesn't get better. It oftentimes starts relatively young. A lot of people have this in the 50s and in the 60s, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds oftentimes is when it starts. So it starts a little earlier than, let's say, Alzheimer's disease on average. And for a long time, it was considered this difficulty just simply controlling your limbs and being able to move around. But with more research, we now realize that Parkinson's disease also has a cognitive element to it. And so one of those is that it makes it difficult to learn this sort of sequence learning that we just described. And so this is showing data from that. So these are, I know it's kind of blurred. This is the best I could get from this article by Shin and Ivory. But this is showing for the controls. These are the sessions, the R's over here. And then these are when they have the sequence. Okay, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, but at any rate, they speed up when the sequence is going, showing that they were learning about the repetitive nature of the sequence. You could prepare to respond to the next trial before the stimulus actually shows up, at least to some degree. So then that can speed up reaction times. But with the Parkinson's patients, this line here is pretty, statistically, this is all flat. So they didn't seem to be able to learn the sequence. And note here, the overall reaction times of the Parkinson's patients for the random trials were actually not different from the control. So I suspect these patients were probably fairly mild Parkinson's patients. And Parkinson's disease is a disease, at least initially, of the basal ganglia, which is a structure in towards the middle of the brain. The one part of this, the caudate, is another one of these C-shaped structures. It's kind of interesting as far as how brain evolution goes, that you have these structures that are kind of shaped like C's. And it's thought that as the human brain, primate brain grew, it kind of stretched and dragged these structures along with it over eons. So that in the basal ganglia, the caudate is one of these main areas. The area that's initially affected in Parkinson's disease is called the substantia nigra. And then it gets worse from there. So then the pathology spreads, and then other symptoms can occur, including cognitive deficits. So people with Parkinson's disease are at high risk for dementia. So with a lot of these progressive neurological disorders, they start off in one location in the brain, like Alzheimer's disease. Starts in the medial temporal lobe, which is why their episodic memory is impaired early on, just like HM, only not as bad initially. And then the pathology spreads to other places. Same thing oftentimes occurs with Parkinson's disease. And to get convergent evidence, here's data from another experiment where people had lesions to the basal ganglia. So not due to basal ganglia pathology from Parkinson's disease, but this is due to a stroke that occurred that affected the basal ganglia. And this is showing for patients the overlap in the areas, because as we talked about a while ago, strokes are, the territories that are affected in strokes vary from one person to the next to the next. So this is showing an area of overlap centered on the basal ganglia in patients that suffered strokes. And they also, I didn't present the data, but they also had impairments in sequence learning, just like we saw here with the Parkinson's patients. So again, we have an eye towards convergent evidence, right? So it could be just Parkinson's patients. There's a problem with them that leads to sequence learning. And maybe it's not just specifically the basal ganglia. Getting other patients with strokes that affect the basal ganglia shows that it's not just Parkinson's specific, but it seems like it's basal ganglia specific. Okay, is that all relatively clear? All right. So let's move on to some other memory systems. So this is one, it's not studied nearly as much as the episodic memory systems and procedural learning and short-term memory. And it was only fairly recently recognized that this perceptual representation system exists. But here, what we're talking about, what is what is remembered? What is the memory content? It's specific improvements in processing a stimulus, right? So this is a memory system that's tied in with a perceptual system. So this would be people with difficulty in perceptual representation systems and vision. They may be just fine with hearing, for example. And so here's one case study that makes that point. The patient, the initials were MS, and so they also had epilepsy and also had surgery. And in this case, the focus of the seizures was farther back in the brain, in and around a visual cortex. And so they had part of the right primary visual cortex was taken out, and some areas around that, the extrastriate cortex, that was also taken out. And they gave Gabriele et al., they gave a bunch of neuropsychological tests to confirm, okay, how is their language function? Is that okay? How is their spatial cognition? How is their episodic memory? And so on. And so once again, they had pretty much a sea of normalcy, but then there's this island of a large deficit. And that deficit related to perceptual priming. So, and this is how they figured that out. So they presented words to MS, and then MS identified what the words were. So they made sure that MS could see the words. So it's not as if they were presenting them in a part of the visual field where MS couldn't see. They could see the words just fine. I think they even repeated what they were as part of this experiment. And then here's the trick as far as testing whether or not this information about having seen a word, having perceived a word, that information is retained and then makes it easier to recognize that word later on. So here's how they did that. They briefly presented words. So you can just flash on the screen for 1/60th of a second, right? 16.7 milliseconds, a word. And most people wouldn't know what that word is. They may not even notice that anything was presented on the screen. But then you make it last a little longer. Let's say you make it last 33 milliseconds, right? Now we move another 16.7 increment. You test them there. You see how well they can identify words. And you maybe move it to 50 milliseconds. And find the point where they're able to identify the words accurately enough, with some standard, it may be 75% correct or whatever they wanted to use. So the key here is that they're measuring the duration that you need to present the word in order to recognize what it is. And in this experiment, MS didn't have this ability this benefit for old words. So you compare words that they just saw and repeated with fresh words that they didn't see. And you make sure they're comparable words. They have the same average number of letters, for example. They're words that are equally common in the language and things like that. But a whole bunch of other groups, control subjects, FOC, I think that was frontal lesions. I'm not sure. People with amnesia, so similar to HM, only not as bad. All of these groups had a benefit for the old words, meaning that when they put the words on the screen, they didn't need to be on the screen as long in order to be identified as it took for a brand new word that hadn't been seen. And so the idea here is that previously perceiving these words conferred a benefit on being able to identify them at shorter durations. Does that make sense? Okay. And they tested this really hard because it is a null result, right? So they had to really make sure that this wasn't just due to being, haphazard testing. And so they carefully tested MS under many trials to show that they really didn't seem to have this priming effect, whereas all these other groups of subjects did show this priming. But there was a dissociation here again, right? We're thinking about the amnestics. For a recognition task of the words, MS recognized the words just as well as controls and the focal prefrontal damage. So it wasn't a matter of them not remembering the words. The memory, we talked earlier about how you interrogate memory. You can sometimes show that somebody remembered something, and if you interrogate it one way, and they may not be able to retrieve the information in a different way. So for MS, if you interrogated them in terms of recall, or in this case, recognition, they would have shown that they had that information. If you interrogate memory by doing this perceptual task, this duration task, that the information didn't seem to be there. So you can think about this, information was deposited, for these words, information was deposited in the episodic memory system, but it wasn't retained, or at least we didn't have evidence that it was retained in this this perceptual memory system. Yeah, I mean, it's really, in some ways, for me, it feels a little spooky when you think about, as you go through your everyday life, information is coming in through your senses, you have thoughts, internal information, and that information is kind of getting farmed out to all these different perceptual systems at the same time. And some of them this information will stick, and others it won't stick so well, but it's all kind of going on in parallel. All right, so let's just wrap up a little bit. I think we may finish a little early today. To try to put this all together, right? We started off with this map, so to speak, of the terrain for memory. We broke it down into short-term memory and long-term memories. Long-term memory, we broke down into declarative memory and non-declarative memory. And then we delved into different systems within declarative and non-declarative memory systems. And we found evidence along these three different lines of thinking about what is a memory system. What is the time range we're talking about? Is it seconds? Are we talking years, decades? What is the content? Is it conscious or is it not conscious? And then also anatomy. Are there certain parts of the brain that if they're damaged, then one particular memory system is susceptible to not working well, whereas other memory systems may be spared. And so the results that we just went over, kind of support that entire layout, right? So the medial temporal lobe for the episodic memory system, the medial temporal lobe is particularly important. On Thursday, we're going to talk about other structures that are also important, like the prefrontal cortex seems to be also very important for episodic memory. But if you have a lesion in prefrontal cortex, your episodic memory doesn't crater. There's subtle aspects of it, like remembering the context, that can be affected. But those patients with prefrontal damage, they're not at all like HM. They have their own set of problems, but it's not the episodic memory deficit that HM exhibited. And here the deficits were for recent events, information that was experienced recently that somehow can't really be transferred to long-term memory. So nowadays we think about the hippocampus as being important for consolidating information, and then farming it out, or other areas of the brain may be important for retaining it for longer periods of time. Why is that? Well, one reason is that HM was able to remember events that happened before his surgery. So that shows that memory of his 10th birthday party or whatever wasn't stored in the hippocampus that was taken out by the neurosurgeon. It was stored somewhere else. Yet when HM had his, his 35th birthday party, not that those of us that have had 35th birthday parties, it's usually not that memorable versus 10 when you're 10. But at any rate, the point being that he would have difficulty encoding future birthday parties and remembering that later, but he could remember previous birthday parties. So that shows that the episodic memories, the long-term episodic memories that were effectively laid down are probably stored somewhere other than in the hippocampus. We talked about damage in association cortex and temporal and parietal areas. Retention, gave an example of auditory information, but it can also work with visual information depending on the patient for short amounts of time. So give people several digits to remember, and then they repeat it back to you. That shows a deficit in short-term memory, oftentimes also called working memory, even though the episodic memory was just fine. And then moving down into the basal ganglia, those patients, they're okay as far as their episodic memory goes. They're okay as far as their short-term memory goes. They had difficulty learning new skills. And they would also have difficulty with conditioning. I didn't show that data, but that sort of learning, this implicit learning about skills, about things that are predictive or repetitive, they had difficulty learning that. And then lastly, this priming effect that we're talking about, this perceptual representation system, that's more specific to damage in sensory cortex that's involved in not only processing sensory information online, but it also, some of that information is retained within the sensory system itself, apparently, which is interesting. It shows that the neurons in, for example, visual cortex, they have multiple jobs. Their job isn't just perceiving information that's coming into the eyes at the moment, at that given moment in time, but it seems like prior information also influences what those neurons are doing. And we know that, at least from the experiment that we just showed, because if you have lesions in those areas, you can perceive the information okay. MS perceived the words okay and could remember them okay. So it showed that he could remember them and perceive them. Yet this priming function memory system seemed to have been knocked out. All right, so I think we should probably just stop there. All right, so are there any questions or comments? All right, well, I think this is the quickest class we've had so far. But we'll just leave it at that then. All right, so on Thursday, we'll delve in even more on a declarative memory and focus a lot on episodic memory. All right, guys, see you on Thursday.
You.